So welcome everybody, Michael Crawford from the Soil CRC, where I'm the CEO. I'm broadcasting to you live from Newcastle, from my home. And we've got a webinar here. We've got speakers in South Australia and Victoria all coming together through Zoom. So hopefully it works for you via this webinar technology. This was a talk we were going to give at our Soil CRC Participants Conference, which was to be held in Adelaide a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, life's changed for everyone. So here we are doing it by webinar, and hopefully the technology works well such that we can hear what we've got to say about this topic. Just a couple of housekeeping things first. We are recording this webinar and it will be then made available via our website, via our YouTube channel, for others to view later. I've already had a few people telling me that they're going to look at it whilst eating their Easter bunny chocolate eggs over Easter. We have a chat function in Zoom where you can make comments as you go along. But importantly, if you want to ask questions, use the Q&A function. There's down the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You click on there, post a question, and we'll answer questions at the end of the talks. What we're doing today is giving you a presentation on a short and important project that we've undertaken in the Soil CRC called Managing Soils for High Performance After a Drought. Many parts of Australia, not all, but many parts of Australia have experienced a long period of dry seasonal conditions. Droughts in many places have been declared. But invariably, it will rain again. In some parts of the country, it has rained again. And farmers, and in turn their consultants and advisors, are looking to get back into full production as soon as possible. But we undertook this project because potentially there's aspects that we need to consider about soil management after a drought that need to be considered, need to be implemented to ensure that we do get back to high performance as quickly as possible. So we've undertaken a small project delivered by South Australian Department, PIRSA, and the Victorian Department, Agriculture Victoria, in collaboration. And today we've got two speakers who are going to give an overview of the findings, of the approach and of the findings and some of the recommendations coming out of this work. So our first speaker is Brian Hughes, who's a principal consultant in soil and land management at PIRSA. And then in turn, he will introduce to Rebecca Mitchell, who's a senior advisor in Agriculture Victoria. So without further ado, I'll pass across to Brian to introduce more of the project. Thank you, Brian.
Good. Thank you, Michael. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, I work for PIRSA, based out of Europe, and works through the soils area. And I should acknowledge the other participants in the project. So Paul Petrie, Nigel Wilhelm, and Vinod Phogat from SARDI, or the SARDI division of PIRSA, and also Mel Cann and Rebecca Mitchell from Agricultural Victoria. I suppose this project really was bringing together information that I suppose, no one can find about practices to manage soil after drought. And the purpose, I suppose, after drought or a long dry period, Rebecca will talk about the survey and I'll talk about the literature research, although Vinod has done much of the work for that, and we'll have a bit of a question answer discussion at the end. The components of the project, or the outputs of the project, really are the survey interview of a range of farmers, advisors and researchers. They said a systematic research, a review of the research on the impact of drought on soil and management options once the drought has broken. And I suppose two fact sheets will produce as well. And at this stage, I suppose the survey is largely completed. The review is about 95% done, and the two fact sheets are just starting. I think I'll cross through to Rebecca now, if that works, right? Hello, Rebecca.
Yep, just getting the presentation up. Wonderful. So my part of the component is undertaking a series of interviews, conversations, surveys with a range of people. And so I'll give you a bit of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about the method that I went through, some of the effects of drought on soil, some of the management options there are, and really importantly, how can we help those drought affected soils to recover. I'm going to do a little bit of a summary and then some knowledge gaps that were identified through the process. So
Rebecca and Brian, I might just cut in there. We're still seeing Brian's slides.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so Brian, maybe you do need to just close down your slides, stop sharing your screen, sorry. Good, and let's see Rebecca's screen. Yes, that's your homepage. I'll just.
We in?
That's the one. Yes, method. Okay.
Beautiful, awesome. Well, you got the audio, and now you'll get the visual as well. So the method really was to complement the literature review that was done, and it was to capture some of those on-ground experiences and the knowledge of people working in the space. So it was working with farmers and advisors, farming assistance groups and researchers. And I was able to have a chat to 17 of those people all across Australia. So I want to just give a really a shout out and a thanks to those people for giving their time to chat with me and share their knowledge. It was a really great process to, I guess, curate knowledge that exists out there. I learned a lot about different areas around the country. I'm based in Bendigo in Victoria, and I feel very upskilled about some of the issues and soil constraints and things out there around the country. So a really great exercise to have undertaken. So in my conversations, I essentially gathered insights from the participants about the effects of drought on soil, like I mentioned earlier, the management strategies, how we can manage those drought affected soils, and then how we can best support their recovery. And really importantly as well, got some knowledge gaps that were identified that are questions that aren't necessarily research questions. Some of them are answers that we already have, and some of them are things like pie in the sky thoughts about what are some of the ways that we can understand drought into the future and things that we can do to support landholders. So some of the effects of drought on soil, I'm going to go through just some of the key things that came through of those 17 conversations. And it's really important to remember that these are, this is from the experience and the knowledge and the thoughts of the people that I interviewed. So I'm essentially presenting a curated version of those discussions today. So what are some of the effects of drought on soil? Obviously, ground cover, as we all know, is a really important thing to protect our soils, and that came across as the #1 issue that can affect soils in drought. Crop type and the pressure to use stubble for stock, or whether you bale it for hay, and how that influences stubble cover was also a strong impact of drought. Erosion, so bare soil is at risk of wind and water erosion. And wind erosion can lead to nutrient loss, and water erosion leading to silting of dams as well. The soil type had a big influence about how drought affected the soils. So the texture, the age of the soil, it all impacted the resilience of how the soils act in drought. Heavier soils can suffer some structural issues, and the lighter soils can suffer some chemical issues such as hydrophobicity, crusting, and are much more possible to go under wind erosion. Hydrophobic soils, so that came up as quite a big issue in how soils act in drought. So water repellents, and that was a real chemical, biological, and physical process. And that the issue with hydrophobic soils is that they just don't capitalise on rainfall events. So management, how can we manage some of those drought affected soils? So grazing management, keeping livestock off paddocks, and important to have a cover level that's determined for when this occurs. So it's not just a response about pulling them off when there is no cover. Determining your own point on your own paddocks about when that happens. And also really important to have some good supplies of fodder for when dry conditions do come. And as well, looking for alternative options to manage the stock. So whether it's selling them, whether it's putting them on sacrifice paddocks or containment areas, or whether it's adjusting the stock to areas that are less affected by drought and have better pasture cover. So pasture management, so assessing if the system is working. That's a drought, and when tough times come, it's a really important opportunity to think about what is my variety of pasture choice working, is the way that I'm managing that working. If not, then it's always easier to manipulate the system rather than start again. So being able to understand the system and then manipulate it, and then have a think about what species or other varieties could be used in the system. Perennial pastures are important in their ability to capture rain, and the dual purpose of crops as well in pasture management. So in terms of crop selection, what can we do? So multi-species cover cropping came up as a really important way to manage how different varieties and different crops respond to drought, and can improve the ability for soils to access rain events and can improve soil resilience. Also, a lot of what was coming up in the conversations was that during droughts and after droughts, it's important to use really reliable crops such as the wheats, the barleys and the oats, as they can provide a good income into the farm. So in terms of managing those crops, so if there really isn't any moisture at all to grow a crop, sometimes it's better to just go into fallow. And especially thinking about early sowing varieties of crops that can maximise the water use. Can we get some of those crops in earlier that will have a longer duration and capitalise on water that does fall? In terms of managing those hydrophobic soils, so having crop residues on the surface is really important to try and break up and stop hydrophobic soils forming, as well as things like strategic tillage, the use of wetting agents, or increasing the clay content, as I mentioned earlier, that sandy soils are more susceptible to becoming hydrophobic. In terms of controlling erosion, so maintaining adequate ground cover is really important to keep the soil in place, and things like clay delving and strategic tillage that are done right can be really important in managing those erosive events. So, and the all important recovery, how can we help soils to recover? So this came up as a really important point, and that understanding basic soil health principles is really important in a farm's ability to recover after drought. So what is the pH of my soil? What is the texture of my soil? Do I understand the soil types that I have across the farm? And how can I help maximize their capacity to recover? And as well, and this was a really interesting one and something I hadn't really thought about, the ability to upskill lenders to help the lenders themselves, the agribusinesses themselves, to understand what farming practices can actually assist farms. So if a farmer goes to their lender and asks for, increase in their loan because they want to undertake some clay delving, the importance of lenders basically understanding what practices will actually help the farm recover and the longevity there. So that was a really interesting point. Some of the drought mindsets that people can come under. So it's important to be able to manage expectations to what the land can and will do. So that kind of ties into understanding the basic soil health principles as well. And a lot of farmers are going to have caution after drought, and that's expected, and that's of course how things go. When things are being tough, we're gonna that caution is gonna lag even when the drought has broken. And so it's a really important time and an opportunity to assess what can be done differently on the farm. So in terms of the wetting up of soil, after drought, it can take a longer time for the soil to wet up than it usually would during normal conditions. And therefore, it's really important to encourage that infiltration. And also importantly, it's often the initial stages of any rainfall event after a drought are going to be the most erosive. So if there is bare ground and there is quite a a lot of rain, so often droughts can be broken by heavier rainfall events, and the land is more susceptibility to erosive. And it's really important to think about the slope on the farm, and even if the farm appears to be flat, slight slopes can have significant effects on how the soil can absorb and wet up after a drought. In terms of ground cover and grazing, so sowing a crop or pasture to get ground cover quickly established is really important, and a lot of that's been happening as we see across the country, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, the eastern states, that the drought has been breaking, and a lot of farmers have been getting something in, whether that was something lying around in the silos or whether that was some feed for their cattle, whatever it is, just getting something into the ground so that it can help get some roots going and help protect the soil. And as well about that, if having those pastures established, making sure that we don't put the stock onto those paddocks too soon to allow for strong root development and for the positives of having some ground cover to actually eventuate onto the farm. As well, so nutrient management. So after droughts, there might be excess nutrients that are going to be available in the system. But however, some nutrients can be lost if there has been erosion. So it's really important to test the nutrient status of the paddocks and the farm. So subsoil constraints. During a drought, or as the drought ends and we move into recovery, it can be an opportunity to prepare soils and to undertake amelioration when the soils are going to be really responsive to those ameliorations, such as deep ripping and subsoil placement. But it's obviously really important to consider the impact that those ameliorations are going to have on the specific soil types, and to implement practices such as controlled traffic farming and other things that will actually prolong the ameliorations and actually reduce the subsoil constraint impact on the system. Soil biology, so soil microbes are pretty cool things. They recover really fast after a drought, and they're important in contributing to surface aggregation, which is important in terms of holding the soil together and reducing erosion. They also contribute to the quick mineralization of nutrients, and it's important to have that ground cover and something growing in the soil so that we can capitalize and have the roots ready to gain the nutrients that are going to be made available quite quickly after a drought. In terms of disease and pests, so plant diseases will generally reduce during drought conditions. However, when the drought breaks, some of those may increase, and there's things out there like Predictor B and other things that can be available to understand the disease pressure. And important as well, if a system is going into wheat, which is quite often the wheat or oats or barley in a cropping system, that the disease pressure is also considered. In terms of weeds and herbicides, so unmanaged weeds can increase after a drought. Weeds are as happy as our crops and our pastures to receive rain. And also really importantly, that herbicides that have been used during drought conditions, their residues may last longer than normal during drought conditions, as they may not have experienced the correct temperatures, the correct biological activity, the correct moisture conditions to actually break down those residues. So it's really important to consider if there is going to be an extra lag time with those residues in the system. So in summary, what are some of the key messages that we can pull from that? So it's important to revisit basic soil literacy skills on farm. It's important to manage the expectations that in dry times, things won't actually be the same. And that's a natural part of our ecological systems. And that it's important to also be flexible in the planning during the droughts and increase preparation for the next period of dry times. Droughts can be an opportunity to assess what works and what doesn't under dry conditions and on the farm, and to think about some of the things that could be done differently to maximise the ability of a farm to respond. It's also an opportunity to undertake amelioration As drought can often be followed by a window of opportunity of good rains and increased mineralisation, it's really important to use that opportunity to react quickly and capitalise on that. And a lot of that comes down to having those basic soil literacy skills, as well as a good understanding of how the different parts of a farm and the soil will actually respond. So this is one of the quotes that came through one of my conversations was, if a soil gets baked dry, it hasn't fallen apart. It is still a productive soil, but make sure you hold the soil where it is. I thought that was a really good quote and a really good summary of a lot of the conversations I had. So I mentioned earlier that we found some knowledge gaps that came up during the conversation. So I turned a lot of those questions and curated those from the interviews. So there were 6 of them that related to biology. So things like, well, how long do the different pools of soil biology survive in drought? And what are their roles under drought conditions? What do the different soil biological organisms actually do? And what are some specific biological species bounce back quicker? Is that dependent? Is it the macrofauna? Is it the fungi? Is it the bacteria? And how can we relate that to profitability and productivity on farm? Is there a microbe that could actually help in reducing hydrophobic soils? In terms of some of the chemistry kind of related questions, how can we manage water repellency that develops in some of the heavier textured soils? And regionally, how much can you reduce nitrogen fertilizer following a drought due to that quick mineralization that we know that can happen? In terms of the soil structure, what statistical work has been undertaken assessing the loss of topsoil due to erosion? And what % of ground cover do you actually need to protect the soil in drought? And what are some of the agronomic costs of losing topsoil due to erosion in a drought? We often know a lot of the nutritional costs, but what are some of the agronomic costs of losing that topsoil? In terms of the farming system, which regenerative agricultural techniques or approaches might actually increase soil resilience in droughts? And what is the mechanism that that's happening? Is there some approaches that are used by traditional owners that could be adopted in modern agricultural systems to deal with drought? And what's the cost to a system of stock eating that last little bit of stubble cover in a paddock compared to retaining that stubble? In terms of some general questions, what happens to weeds with fodder moving around the country during drought? Can we be doing better ground cover monitoring so farmers can be advised when things might be getting bad on their farm? And if you overcome your soil constraints, soil seems to respond better after a drought. What's that related to? Is that related to soil health or microbial activity, or is it a structural response or a chemical response? So they're not necessarily the next big questions that we need to ask, but these are the things that people are thinking about in terms of that drought and how we can make those soils recover and be really high performing after drought conditions. So thanks everyone for listening to that, and special thanks to the 17 people that I was able to have conversations with and glean an amazing amount of knowledge from. So I'll pass back to Brian, who will take us on the journey of the literature review.
Okay, thanks. Now I'll just hopefully you're back with me.
Yeah, Brian, I think you realise that it's the other screen we need to be sharing.
The other screen.
The same issue we had before.
Which is what's on mine, but hang on. Hang on a second. Share.
That's it. Oh, it's all right. So it's back to you.
So we're back in there.
Yeah, with this, everyone, I'm sure you appreciate that we're all learning our way around Zoom and Zoom webinars as we go. But
if you've got that one, is that changing now?
We'll do it again.
Sorry?
Hasn't come up yet.
Hasn't come up. Hang on, I might have to go back to share that one again.
while we're waiting, one of the questions asked was for the survey of the 17 farmers, which states were covered, and did one state dominate? So I'll just answer that one. So it was a range of farmers, advisors, farming systems group members, researchers, and that was across Queensland, New South Wales, WA, Victoria and South Australia, and it was equal representation across those states. So thanks for that great question, and hopefully that answers.
Yeah, thanks. Right. And Brian, yeah, we can see your screen well. So
yeah, if I can manually change it, that'll be fine, I think.
Yeah.
So just back to the, I suppose, the review. As I mentioned, Vinod has done the bulk of the work here, but we've sort of had comments from other people in the team. Initially aimed to look at a wide range of the literature across a range of issues, from physical, chemical, biological, ecological. You can see the initial flow diagram is set up, but actually found a lot of the documents, or limited documents, specifically relating to drought effects on soils and I suppose recovery of those. However, there's a large number of docs that relate to sort of key soil issues across a range of issues of water use efficiency, soil health, erosion prevention. So basically, I'll just be talking a bit more, the talk will be split into really the drought impacts on soils, and then sort of going on the short-term and long-term practices, I suppose, and there'll be some overlap with Rebecca's talk, which I suppose is understandable in some ways, and probably a good thing. So just initially, I suppose, just recognising there's a lot of soil type and crop differences, and I suppose the different soils respond quite differently to the drought conditions. Within the low rainfall areas, there's a lot of sandy or duplex calcareous soils are common, and I suppose we've seen droughts affecting sort of medium rainfall plus in recent times as well, and other range of soils. Plant available water is very much driven by the clay content, I suppose, and we see, I suppose, the heavier soils perhaps store up to double the amount of water a sandy soil can, but the sandy soils need much less to wet up. Again, germination is affected by soil types. The physical constraints will reduce the plant available water, and so the least limiting water range sort of takes into account some of those issues, and issues such as high bulk density, leading to compaction, salinity, sodicity, boron, are common on these soils that we see, I suppose, regularly affected by drought. And again, the crop lower limit is affected by many of these properties, including texture, organic carbon, and the subsoil constraints. And also important to recognise that certain plants and deep-rooted crops and plants can manage the stress a lot better than others. So some of the deep-rooted plants like seal rye, wheat and lupins. So just moving on to some of, I suppose, the findings of the review, and particularly the drought impacts on soils. And this is probably thinking about soils where there isn't an erosion problem. In this case, so the moisture loss, the high evaporation, the heat stress leads to reduced mineralisation from crop residues, reduced microbial activity, various critical matrix potentials. The matrix potential, I suppose, differs with different organisms, and they'll respond differently. Fungi can be detected in higher numbers than bacteria during hot, dry periods, and I suppose Scott et al. Had a generalised relationship for this, which let's get that through to there, and really talks about, I suppose, water content on the x-axis, but also the oxygen diffusion limit, which basically, I suppose, goes up as the water goes down. So this one here should be the substrate diffusion, which does the reverse. And when you get these things in combination, you'll have much higher microbial activity. But this, I suppose, optimum amount can vary depending on the actual the situation there, and I suppose the type of microbe you're looking at. So moving on to other key findings, again, we're not particularly looking at erosion yet. Certainly the drought and dry conditions can lead to increased intensity of subsoil constraints, increases in osmotic potential, water movement to roots restricted, nutrient uptake and diffusion reduced, and the toxicity of things like boron and sodium chloride becoming more severe. And I suppose on the from Dang in 2006, some examples there in Queensland, and I suppose that there's two things to note here is just this is looking wheat lower limits, and I suppose as it highlights, I suppose, the unused water. So as the salinity increases, you're getting, I suppose, less water that's being used by the plant. As the ESP increases, you're having a similar effect, whereas the chloride increases, your weak lower limit is rising, and there's less of that water being used. So those conditions are becoming worse, I suppose. Running through, I suppose, and the next stage is really having what are the drought impacts on soils with erosion risk or erosion happening, and I suppose there's a lot of study looking at the soil loss from erosion and the fertility loss and carbon loss associated with that. Can certainly lead to increased structural degradation in certain soil types. I suppose that the dust coming off of studies looking at what the content of dust is, I suppose, from erosion and the high fertility of the dust. Exposure to subsoil constraints is certainly one that I've seen where things like dry saline land become exposed during a drought and never quite recover. And once you start getting some damage and some sand blowing around, your sandblasting and cover is further reduced just by the dust and the sand damaging other plants there, or either burying it or abrading it. And dust storms can have wide offside impacts, and there have been a few studies looking at that, from power to human health issues. In some cases, there's increased risks for weeds and soil-borne diseases, but not in some cases. It can also be better as well. There's generally a decrease in yield potential if you've had significant erosion or reduced pasture establishment, and you've changed nutrient cycling aspects. And as Beck mentioned also, just that the water erosion risk is there, ever present, I suppose, and often we seem to see droughts ending with a significant water erosion event. In terms of the review, having a look at some of the short-term practices and going on a bit again from Beck's talk, during the drought, the sort of destocking, confinement, feeding, trying to maintain cover are sort of key issues. Certainly where soils begin to erode, there are cases where things like emergency tillage, we've certainly used that in South Australia in the sandy loam type soils, can actually stop I suppose, the drift on the paddock. If the soil's too sandy or if it's too heavy, you probably don't need it either, I suppose, but in certain situations, emergency tillage has been used quite widely. And immediately after, I suppose, some of the key aspects that came through were really having a look at certainly soil testing to really understand, I suppose, where that soil's at, and if so, targeting fertiliser. You may need specific weed control and disease control, and understand and really getting into crop establishment techniques following the drought with conservation tillage to conserve the water, and as Beck mentioned, getting the soil cover quickly. Just some examples there of a containment feeding, and I suppose some shots also of emergency tillage, either a whole paddock one or strip cultivation, in that case, in the bottom one. And I suppose there's quite a bit of stuff looking at examples of how some of the drought management stuff has been improving over time. And this is from Department of Environment Water in SA, showing initially I suppose the graph on the left there is showing the days of protection. And if you go from about 2000 to 2017 in this graph, you can actually see that these were done through roadside surveys initially, and there's a little bit of GIS work in there as well now. Sorry, remote sensing in there as well. But in terms of the number of days of protection, so you can sort of see those about 2000, you're around that 270 sort of days, and you're now getting up to close to 330, 340 days that the soil's actually got adequate cover. So we've seen a huge improvement in the cover levels across South Australia and the different regions. In a parallel process, I suppose, this is from a farmer survey, just the uptake of no-till has gone from around about 9% to 77% in that period. And I suppose, some other surveys I've seen up to over 90% in some cases. And the use of confinement feeding, again, 30 to 60%, that's from Murray-Darling Basin figures. So really good examples of uptake of practices over a couple of decades, I suppose, in that sense. And then I suppose moving into some of the longer term findings and which are about, I suppose, long-term resilience of soils. Now, many of these things are that the information is not really written specifically for drought or getting out of drought conditions. It's really looking at how can you improve soils. But I suppose that the research has got some similarities in terms of what you're trying to achieve with it. So for sandy soils, addressing water repellents, clay incorporation, conservation, tillage, deep ripping are all, I suppose, practices that have come a fair way over time, and we've got a lot more information on. The table on the right, again, I suppose, is Amanda Chappell's work from South Australia, just having a look at organic carbon stocks in unmodified controls versus sandy soils that have been clayed or delved or spaded. And you can see significant increases, I suppose, in the amount of carbon in those as you increase the texture by adding some clay to it. And while there's differences between I suppose the data, it certainly does show that one way of improving the carbon is to add some clay to the soil. Some of the other key findings, certainly look at moisture conservation practices, stubble and crop retention, fertiliser amendments and applications, and amelioration of subsoil constraints. And I've put a question mark on that because I think we're still, certainly through the CAC and other programs, we're still looking at finding some of the best solutions to some of these at this stage, and more work will come. So just really reflecting on this. So I should say the increase in organic carbon, certainly around the southeast ones, was around about that 1.5 to 1.9 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year on those soils. The Eyre Peninsula stuff had a bit more noise in it, and it was a bit shorter periods, but did demonstrate you can increase carbon with the texture, which we don't see a lot of. Some of the other examples, and there's a lot of different examples in the literature review of different practices and I suppose improving soils and their resilience, and this is just an example from Queensland and New South Wales, looking at different references and gypsum, and again, quite big increases in yield over a range of references by adding gypsum to soda soils in Queensland. Another more recent stuff from Brian Hughes in SARDI at Loxton, looking at deep ripping sand. So they're looking at different depths of ripping on the sand in the mallee, and significant yield responses. The question often is, and certainly Brian will be looking at, is, how long can you make this last, or how often do you need to do it? And once you've got rid of the hard pan, can you not form it again, I suppose. Some work from Hoyle in Western Australia. My understanding, this is off of a small paddock, but looking at the range of carbons with the range of actual. So I've just. And I suppose the upper and lower organic carbons by clay content. I suppose really what this is trying to tell us is that there is a range of carbon contents out there, that the texture plays a part in that. And I suppose looking towards the future is the quote from Hall, soil with high organic carbon will return to its former state more rapidly after the drought breaks, in a soil with low organic carbon. And I think that's certainly one of our aims, is in improving soils. So running through some of the key messages, I think that we've tried to establish. Erosion control is paramount, and I suppose whether these are for landholders or advisors, but strengthening the soil data and resource and knowledge that we know about, really understanding those different characteristics of the soil and the hydraulic parameters. Even during a drought and following a drought, we need some real-time monitoring and preparedness to act on some things, which is easier said than done, as farmers are often stressed for a lot of reasons. Generally improving soil organic matter of particular soils and land uses. Improving the nutrient amendment application of those, and whether this could be linked to a precision ag type thing as well. Increasing microbial activity and biodiversity, and I suppose addressing climate change issues through this mitigations and resilience of the soil is probably another outcome of doing these things. And I suppose where to, so making the most of soils after drought, certainly some of those key things, just going through them again was, strengthening the soil test base sort of fertiliser and mineral application, having the ability to really understand where and how we need to put things out and where they'll have the best benefit. Methods of building organic matter, Paul, and biological activity, and I said particularly in certain soil types and certain land uses. Better addressing subsoil constraints. Some of these things we can, but others we're still learning how to do it. Evaluating losses by water erosion, which is something which could be quite significant. And certainly some of the droughts I've been involved in, we seem to have had a major erosion event at the end of them. And developing this long-term resilience. And I suppose Vinod was also raised the point, I suppose, that we need more focus on field-based studies of drought recovery rather than the impact, I suppose. And just a shot from Marianne Young, it's sort of cheating a little bit. It was probably an eroding paddock following a fire, but it went from what it looked like in December 2015 to record crops in 2016. So these areas do come back. It's probably the other comment I'd make. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we had a few questions that came through during the presentation. So one of them was answered through Brian's presentation. So that's great that that happened. And the other one was directed towards me, but I'm sure that Brian and Vinod, you might be able to answer that as well. So it was about that I mentioned the importance of maintaining soil resilience, and can I elaborate on that and then how I've defined resilience. So we did mention resilience quite a lot, and I guess in terms of defining resilience, in my mind, it's about that an event that impacts something doesn't impact it to the same extent going forward. So for a drought, so in terms of the soil being resilient, so that in one period of drought, that the next time that the soil is not as impacted and the system is not as impacted by that going forward. So whether it's that less erosion occurs, whether it's that greater water infiltration occurs, all those kind of things. So that's in terms of how I've defined resilience. And I mentioned resilience in my presentations in terms of soil type and cover cropping. So in the cover cropping, it was in relation to the fact that, and Brian's presentation touched on it as well, in terms of the importance of maintaining organic matter during drought conditions, and that cover cropping is one of those ways of maintaining organic matter, and therefore with the increased organic matter, the ability for the soil to then capture some of the rain events and increase infiltration is increased. And in terms of soil type, it's about understanding how the water is going to move in those systems, and therefore how to maximise and treat the different soils differently based on their soil type. So do you have any comments on that, Brian or Vinod, in terms of resilience?
No, I think that's fine, and it's probably certainly through our stuff, it is having that ability to actually have the right tests for it too, I suppose, just making sure we can test and interpret it that way as well.
So we had another question that came through. What are some of the key gaps that should be addressed by RD&E under the soil CRC or with other funding? So do you have any comments to that?
I'm not sure whether, Vinod, are you on there, Vinod? Did you want to comment on that one? Or?
You can comment on that.
Yeah, so I suppose from a emerging after drought, probably one of the things you picked up there was that there's a lot of work on improving soils generally, and there's a lot of stuff looking at the impact of the drought, but there's not too much on as you're coming out of the drought, what some of the, I suppose in terms of assessing some of the practices and things in that process.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so most of these, because we have gone through this literature on the drought, so when we started just looking at the studies, we were not able to find the actual studies that has been taken in the field conditions. So most of the studies, they were focused on just assessing the impact of drought and severity of drought, the longevity of drought on the crops and on the how to maintain the productivity of the crops, not actually the impact on soils, how soils they are behaving under drought, what sort of the soil attributes they are changing, they are being modified by the impact of drought, like how the water holding capacity of the soils, it's going to changing with the drought situation, elongation of the drought. What sorts of the attributes like organic matter contents, the mineralization capacity of the soils, how they are changing over the drought onset and during the recovery. And most of the studies we found during the recovery, they are just in the fact sheets. So how farmers, they are just managing their soils for better productivity, but most of the studies we found, they in the laboratory conditions, they have been conducted in the laboratory conditions. Just doing these studies, just putting some moisture, different moisture level and different organic matter level, and then studying the soils, but not actual field studies. I think they are less during that recovery phase. So that's the major comment that we find during this lit review on this topic. And that's, I think, what we have the major lacking part. So we have to go out into the field, and we have to have more field-based studies. Of course, we should have the laboratory-based studies as well, because that's the stepping stones, and then we should go out and we should have more studies under the field during the drought and recovery period. We should have studies in the field. That's what we have seen in the literature.
And I can add to that, that one of the things that came through the interviews was in terms of how, so we know that erosion's a significant consequence of drought and the low ground cover and the systems and how all that works. And then, but how can we actually understand the loss of that due to erosion in terms of the agronomic impacts on the farm? So that's something that kind of came up in quite a few of those discussions about, well, you know, how can we assess that, and is that something that's important and that we can understand? And yeah, due to, I guess, a lack of a lot of the during drought, yeah, those kind of assessments. So there was another question in terms of, we mentioned about the rapid mineralization coming out of drought, and so how can a farmer potentially account for this greater mineral N content? Is there a simple test? So that was actually one of the questions that came out of, as a knowledge gap that came out of my conversations, was that, you know, is there a regional way, you know, regionally specific way of how we can understand what may have been kept and available in the soil following a drought. And I guess from a lot of my conversations, soil testing was one of those things to do to understand that. And as well as suggestions about whether it's, you know, splitting the nitrogen application and seeing how the crops respond early and putting more later. But I don't, do you have any comments on that, Brian or Vinod, in terms of the mineralization of N?
I don't know of any way of calculating. You don't have any way of calculating an extra bit, if that's what we're leading to, I suppose. I mean, the conventional stuff is your soil tests and split applications, as you said. I mean, to some extent, the phosphorus, we suspect in a lot of soils, some of the phosphorus will be maintained from the failed crop the year before, but there's certain soil types that won't happen in as well, so where it's been fixed or whatever. So nothing like a soil test to give us a bit of an idea on those.
Yeah, there are some studies on nitrogen during when we cover our soils with the crop residues during the drought, and then there is a drought break, and then I think we should take care of the degree of decomposition of our organic matter, because when we apply nitrogen at that stage, some of the nitrogen is being taken up by the microbes for the mineralization of the substrate, and that is not immediately available to crops. So it's a kind of immobilized amount of nitrogen is there during the recovery phase, first month or so. So that is one thing that some of the studies have mentioned that. So about the nitrogen, specifically when we have a lot of residue undecomposed on the surface or incorporated soils. So during that phase, we should be take care of that nitrogen, because we have a wider CN component within our soils. Wide CN component means microbes will immobilize some of our added nitrogen through the fertilizers. So that's one thing that's been studied. I found during the literature review on nitrate. And for the phosphorus, I think when there is complete crop failure and we have applied phosphorus in the crop before during drought phase, then the phosphorus, because when we apply in the soils, it depend on what kind of soils we have got. It can transform quickly if we have calcium available there. It could be precipitated as calcium phosphate and not available after or consequent upon the drought recovery phase. So these things, I think, could be better understand with further studies. We have more studies on different soils and different drought recovery phase, and how much rainfall we are getting during the recovery phase. So this is a complex kind of things. Having nutrition at one component, and we have organic matter one component, or soil having clay, different kind of clay, what kind of clay we have. So these kind of studies, I think, could help improve our understanding further to deal with this drought recovery phase.
Thanks for that, Vinod. There's just one last question that's come through, and that was talking about if during my interview processes, did anyone report any positive outcomes through physical management practices like soil inversion? And if so, did they supplement with any chemical biological approaches? So through my conversations especially with people coming from WA and South Australia with a lot of the deep sands, there was a lot of talk about the positive impact that things like clay delving were having in the soil, and that kind of triple effect of reducing the hydrophobicity of the soil, reducing the erosion with having the increased clay content higher up in the profile and holding the soil down, so that when the wind wind was coming, it was holding the soil in place, as well as increasing the ability for the soil to hold moisture. So that was coming through really strongly in a lot of those conversations. And in terms of, did they supplement that with chemical and biological approaches, there was a lot of talk about how subsoil amelioration, in terms of using gypsum and lime and organic matter and placing that deeper in the soil, was having really beneficial impacts, as well as the physical change to the soil. So hopefully that answers that question, and we're in the process of putting together those fact sheets, and hopefully they'll be a really good resource for everyone in terms of a lot of the questions and things that have come out of today.
Okay, good. Listen, I might come in now. It's almost 1 o'clock and we're going to finish. And I think it's been really good, Brian and Rebecca, for the talk, and also Vinod for the work you've done in the background and bringing a lot of this together. As Brian and Rebecca were just alluding to, next steps are to complete the final report and bring that together, and that will be made available through the Source CRC website. But importantly, we're looking to produce guidelines in an easily accessible format via fact sheet type equivalent, and those dot points, those guidelines being useful for farmers and for their advisors to take and apply and expand upon in their local region. This, as you can see from this process, it's partly through expert knowledge, partly through what's in the literature. There's not a great deal that's specifically about this in the literature. If any of you in the audience today have been stimulated to contribute your own experiences or expertise to this, please get in touch with Brian or Rebecca and pass that on so they can incorporate those learnings into the final piece of work here. This webinar will be made available on our website for our YouTube channel, so look for that in the coming days. I thank you all for your time. If you do have additional questions, and Felicity, sorry, I do see you've got one there. We'll address that offline. Thank you everyone for your attention, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.